So this is just a quick video explaining the dynamic nature of the Portal 2 soundtrack. I'm not doing a full analysis video as I think the OST has been praised enough, but something that I find interesting about the music that I don't think is talked about enough. Unlike most quote-unquote dynamic music, at least in the first-person shooter genre, Portal 2 implements its soundtrack directly with the action that's being performed. This isn't anything particularly new as it's been done with games even as old as Banjo-Kazooie. For example, in Banjo-Kazooie, when you go underwater, the level's melody stays the same, but the instruments swap out for something more aquatic and I guess underwater feeling. But the way Portal 2 implements this is completely different. You see, instead of swapping out the instruments or speeding up the tempo, the game adds a stem on top of the soundtrack in accordance to 4 different actions that I'm going to be talking about. The first is the blue propulsion gel. When you bounce on it, the soundtrack adds on an arpeggiated sine wave. How high you jump determines how loud the arp is. Next is the orange propulsion gel. Whenever you are getting launched by the orange goo, it will play a harsher saw wave synth, and this time, depending on how fast you go, will determine the tempo of the ARP. Also, a side note, if you are launching through a portal, the arpeggiation will add in a second note. Moving on to the hover tubes, or whatever you call these things, basically whenever you are sucked into a tube, it will cut off the high frequencies of the entire soundtrack and add chords on top of it in key with the music. These chords will also change depending on what part of the soundtrack they're catering for. And lastly, the launch pads. These things will play a fast, plucky pattern of synths and percussion whenever you are launched into the air. There's nothing really to note on how they function, aside from the fact that there are different versions of them depending on what music is currently being played, much like the hover tubes. All of these elements have one thing in common, and that is that they don't alter or take away from the music. They instead add layers on top of the soundtrack, which works really well because the majority of the Portal 2 OST is fairly minimal, leaving room for these moments of action. This creates a smooth and seamless addition that you might not have noticed when playing through this game, and it's just another small reason why Valve games hold up all these years later.